So, hi everyone, and welcome to another webinar on health, well-being, and literature on our series. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Anne Rugemeyer. She studied comparative literature, English, and literary and history in Tübingen, in Germany, and at Oxford Brookes University in the UK. From 2009 to 2013, she held a scholarship at the Gießen Graduate Center for the Study of Culture, GCSC, where she conducted a PhD project on relational autobiographies in contemporary English literatures. From 2015 to 2017, she worked as junior research group leader at Heidelberg School of Education. And from 2017 to 2022, she held a postdoc position in the ERC-funded project Lists in Literature and Culture at Freiburg University. Her research interests include life writing, narratology, medical humanities, and literary lists. The co-written monograph, Literary Lists, A Short History of Form and Function, will be published by Palgrave in July this year. Since May 2022, Anna is principal investigator of the project Poetics of Isolation in English Literature, 17th to 21st Century, which is funded by the German research organization DFG Eigene Stelle. And the title of her talk today is Lists, Literature, and Graphic Medicine. All is yours.
Yes, thank you for a very kind introduction. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you for having me, and thank you especially to all those who participate from South German context, because I know many of you are in university holidays at the moment. So thank you for joining us today. My title is rather general, and it is, of course, an offspring of this ERC project that I have been part of that concentrated on lists. And I realized at the beginning that there are especially a lot of lists in literature that deal with medicine and well-being. And this will be kind of a survey today, what I found. So actually what I plan to do is to touch upon 5 texts from 4 centuries and provide you with an impression of how lists have been used by writers whose texts focus on health and illness-related issues. Okay, yes. So we will first look at the text by Daniel Defoe that deals with questions of representation. And what is closer to the truth? Is it numbers or is it words? Is it data or is it stories? Then we will turn towards Charles Dickens and his novel Nicholas Nickleby. And this is about lists, immersion, and rhetoric. And then we come to the 20th century and we look at different plays by female writers. So Margaret Atwood's one-act play Wit, and also at Sarah Kane's 448 Psychosis. And this is about medical checklists from a patient's perspective. And it is also about the poetics of lists. And finally, we will turn to a graphic novel, Alan Forney's Marbles, and think about what it means to have the possibility to go visual and then to dialogize stories and data and words and pictures in new ways, and what this does to the list and the remediation of practical lists. But lists is such a specific term that I thought before we start, we at least have to have some shared ground with regards to, somebody wants to enter, yeah, thank you, with regard to definitions. So I use the list, or I understand the list as a hyponym that comprises a range of literary techniques. So you can think about epic catalogs, or the blazon, or inventories, or collections, or enumerative descriptions, or all kinds of inserted lists as you find them in Nick Hornby or in Bridget Jones' Diary. And this diversity that is typical for the form, of course, goes back to the fact that the list is a literary constant. So we find it in antiquity. Just think about Homer's Catalogue of Ships. And we also find it in postmodernism. And it can also be found in all kinds of different genres. So to sum it up, the list for me is a formal device characterized by several, usually 3 or more, distinct elements in succession that are in loose, if at all, syntactic and conceptual coherence. And one of the list scholars who wrote one of the most important monographs, or actually it is a catalog that is connected to an exhibition, is by Umberto Eco. And he makes a very useful, but also not very clear distinction between practical or pragmatic and poetic lists. And a pragmatic list would be a to-do list, so something you use for a specific purpose. And a literary list or a poetic list actually is for Eco a list that is used for any artistic and in whatever art form. And this means, as you can see on the cover of his monograph for Eco, the list can be something that you can find in paintings or in print. So, for example, Andy Warhol's Heinz tomato soup cans, where you have one of these cans next to the other. So a repetition of this image is for him a typical visual list. Or he talks about Maurice Ravel's Bolero that has this typical distinct element that always is repeated, the motif, as a musical list. So na 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 na, and this is repeated again and again. This is a musical list for Umberto Eco. Okay, but this differentiation between the practical and the literary list might be important today. If I ask you about typical list makers in English literature, one of the first examples coming to your mind will probably be Daniel Defoe and Robinson Crusoe. Critics have traditionally explained Defoe's lists in terms of his capitalist values and saw them as a proof of his accountant's mentality. Accounting and early statistics also feature in another of his works that we want to deal with today, and that is the Journal of the Plague Year. Defoe presents the novel as an eyewitness account by a protagonist he calls HF, and this might be his uncle, who lived during the plague in London of 1665. Of course, Defoe uses him as a first-person narrator, so this is a fictional autobiography. He starts in medias res with an account of the very first case of the plague, and then interrupts his prose narrative to insert a simple table enumerating death by plague and the number of urban areas affected by the plague. And it was printed in the Weekly Bill of Mortality in the usual manner, thus: plague 2, parishes infected 1. Some lines later, the first-person narrator informs us that the ordinary burials increased in number considerably, and he again confronts his readers with a list, this time a much longer one. Defoe's lists are close to the historical documents of the time, the Bills of Mortality, and he surely uses the administrative list form as a stylistic device to suggest the verisimilitude of his account. Defoe's list performs both an administrative function, so this is data management, and serve as a means to police, so monitor and control the citizens of London. And these were the aims of these lists of mortality in the early nation-state and its early statistical systems. Yet inverting the list, I argue, is not only about administration and control, and it is also about the question, how can we represent reality? Especially, how can we represent disaster, grief, catastrophe? The origin of the novel coincided with 18th century breakthroughs in empirical epistemology. Empiricism and the revolution of science share with the early novel a propensity for exact observation, detailed description, and veracity. Yet, to a certain extent, the genesis of the novel also opposed the ideals of empiricism. Empiricists preferred to trust the supposed purity and plainness of numbers, rather than the ornamental abundance and imprecision of words. So while the new sciences were critical of the verbosity and the newly emerging novel, there was considerable skepticism towards the post-fact-based numerical truth on which statistic reference relied. Literary scholar Nicholas Seeger suggests that Defoe's account of the plague should be read as a reaction to, rather than an endorsement of, 18th century quantification projects. Even though Defoe repeatedly reproduces lists, his first-person narrator also continually questions their reliability and also draws attention to existing inconsistencies. Seen in this context, the novel is a reflection on the question of how to represent reality most accurately. Defoe's negotiation of the truth value of data-driven or story-based representation culminates in the scene in which H.F., the protagonist, views the great burial pit at Cripplegate. Defoe describes the epidemic as driving us, quote, out of all measures, and states that people are dying by heaps, that is to say, without account. The passage has been interpreted as an indirect critique of science's hubris and naive belief in the representational abilities of numbers. In the face of people dying by heaps, both numbers and words fail to offer a representation of the real. And here the word account is very important because just like the Greek katalogein, it means both. It means to just count, but also to narrate. And to account means to collect numbers, but it also means to tell a story. And I think for Defoe, yes, he is for words. He writes novels and he's very critical towards data and numerical representation. But as his protagonist stands there and views this burial pit at Cripplegate, he has to admit that, well, when he stands there and has this view, neither numbers nor words will do. So this is without account. In this short introduction to the intersections of lists, medicine, and literature throughout the centuries, I cannot spend much time on the 19th century, but let me mention one of my impressions. The 19th century, with its long descriptions, and especially with the sentimental novel, authors often use the list as a means of immersion and as a strong rhetorical tool that might mobilize their audiences. What I mean will become clear when we look at Dickens's Nicholas Nickleby. Dickens uses lists to achieve a merging of the character's mind and the reader's mind. In chapter 8, entitled Of the Internal Economy of Dotheboys Hall, Nicholas arrives at the school run by Mr. and Mrs. Squeers, where he has accepted a job as a teaching assistant. It is fashioned after the example of those cheap Yorkshire schools that in exchange for fees took in unwanted or illegitimate boys, usually from the south of England, promising to educate them. In the preface, Dickens describes the Yorkshire schoolmasters as, quote, ignorant, sordid, brutal men to whom few considerate persons would have entrusted the board and lodging of a horse or a dog, unquote. Squeers, the headmaster, warns Nicholas that Dotheboys Hall is not exactly a hall. When Nicholas enters the schoolroom for the first time, he even compares it to a barn, and then gradually he sees them, the pupils. Pale and haggard faces, lank and bony figures, children with the countenance of old men, deformities with iron upon their limbs, boys of stunted growth, and others whose long meagre legs would hardly bear their stooping bodies, all crowded on the view together. There were the bleared eye, the hairy lip, the crooked foot. As the first-person narrator tries to comprehend what he sees in front of him, he mentally breaks down the crowd into its individual components: pale and haggard faces, lank and bony figures. The scene has cinematographic qualities. while reading remerge our mental processing with the person narrator's gradual processing of what he sees. As readers engage with this perspective, they become part of the fictional world. The list-based description creates a certain experiential immediacy. Nicholas' assessment of the scene culminates in another list, which is an increasingly grim enumeration and evaluation of what is going on in Dotheboys Hall. With every kindly sympathy and affection blasted in its birth, with every young and healthy feeling flocked and starved down, with every revengeful passion that can fester in swollen hearts eating its evil way to their core in silence, what an incipient hell was breeding here. The exclamation mark at the end of this list lends expression to the emotionally charged workings of Nicholas' mind, and simultaneously signals a rhetorically refined speech addressed to the reader. As some of you know, Dickens' fictional story had an effect on reality. His immersive description of the school eventually led to the closure of some of the Yorkshire schools. Now we turn towards the 20th century. After looking at novels by canonical male authors, it's now time to look at texts by female writers, and also time to look at other genres. Therefore, I decided to take a look at Margaret Atwood's one-act play Wit, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1999. This play reflects on the fact that from the beginning of their studies through to the clinical routines in the hospital, the form of the list is a daily working tool for medical students and doctors alike. Medical history files, clinical checklists, and therapy schedules not only shape the clinical everyday, but arguably deeply influence the physician's perspective on the patient. Paul Kalanithi, a neurosurgeon who was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, pointedly describes this effect when he states, quote, "I was not a patient, I was a problem, a box to be checked off," unquote. As they allow professionals to collect and to categorize information about specific patients, their symptoms, and their histories, medical lists serve as tools to structure and to apparently control the contingency connected to illness. Lists translate the disease into a discourse in which it is manageable. Furthermore, medical lists emblematically represent the medical model of illness, which asserts authority over diagnosis and treatment of the individual patient. In Mom's Cancer, Brian Fees pointedly draws our attention to this close relationship between the list and professional authority when he comments, "Everyone's an expert armed with a handy checklist." The list is thus depicted as a medical management tool that bends the felt contingency of illness by the routine of accumulating test results and by cataloging treatment options. The reliance on checklists in the clinical everyday is, of course, not per se a bad thing. As Atul Gawande, professor of surgery at Harvard Medical School and staff writer at The New Yorker, convincingly claims in his checklist manifesto, complex tasks in a complex world can be dealt with much more effectively if professionals humbly surrender to the simplest means of control, which is the checklist. Yet, as cardiologist Sandeep Johar rightly observes, checklists lack flexibility. They might be useful for simple procedures like central line insertion, but they are hardly a panacea for the myriad ills of modern medicine. Patients are too varied, their physiologies too diverse, and our knowledge still too limited. With this quote, Johar highlights the dangers standardization, which is intricately connected to checklist cultures in medicine. And this danger is also addressed in Margaret Atwood's one-act play Wit, where the terminal cancer patient Vivian Baring is interviewed with the help of a medical history questionnaire by Jason Posner. The practice of history-taking, a procedure guided by a standardized list of questions, invest the doctor with an authority that puts him in the position to evaluate the patient. He is in charge of the situation, while the ill person is relegated and reduced to her role as a patient. Bestow with the authority of scientification, medical lists ultimately medicalize and thus objectify the ill. Literary illness narratives reveal the nature of clinical checklists as professional devices that create a compliant patient whose own narrative is silenced for the sake of medicine's methods and routines. So what you see here is Dr. Jason Posner, or Cory DiNardo, sitting on the stage and having this medical checklist in his hand, asking questions. And as you see, he is not really interested in the person, in the patient as a person. So they just get it right from the beginning that he says, well, I do already know that you are a professor of Renaissance poetry and literature, so we do not have to talk about this. And then he's very relieved that they do not have to address this any further. And the same happens in this very long interview that follows. And the stage directions tell us that this has to be done extremely quickly. So he asks her, how old are you? And she says 50. Are you married? No. Are your parents living? No. How and when did they die? My father suddenly, when I was 20, of a heart attack. My mother slowly, when I was 41 and 42, of cancer, breast cancer. Cancer? Breast cancer. I see. Any siblings? No. Do you have any questions so far? Not so far. Well, that about does it for your life history. And of course, this doesn't do it at all for her life history, but the sentence shows that the focus has shifted, not from any interested in her as a person, but only as a patient. And if you do not know this very short play, I suggest you just read it and you find many more examples of this list effect. Okay. Another dramatic text about illness, this time not about a physical one, but a mental impairment that invites us to think about the usage of lists, is Sarah Kane's 448 Psychosis. 448 was Sarah Kane's last work, first staged in June 2000, nearly a year and a half after Kane's death by suicide on the 20th of February 1999. To anchor this dramatic text solely in the story of the author's life or death would, however, not do justice to the play. In fact, Kane's last piece stands in continuity with themes and formal experimentation of her earlier works. The text corpus consists of, among other things, inner monologues, typographical experimentation, and highly fragmentary lists of words. So sometimes it looks more like poetry than like a dramatic text. Unpleasant, unacceptable, uninspiring, impenetrable, irrelevant, irreverent, irreligious, unrepentant, dislike, dislocate, disembody, deconstruct. This is just one of many pages that has a system of just listing a lot of adjectives or verbs that share maybe just a syllable or a sound or anything. The fragmentic and collage-like dramatic text allows us to experience, maybe, the shattering of the first-person speaker's psyche. Alan Kaplan describes the clinical picture as follows. Psychosis is thought disorder characterized by hallucinations, disorganized speech, and delusional thinking, all of which contribute to a feeling of gross sensory overload. The collapsing of the typical dramatic markers forces readers to experience the dissolution and disorientation experienced by those suffering from psychotic disorder. So maybe this is for our experientiality, so that we might share this impression when you just can't make sense of something. Yet the lack of clear distinctions not only emphasizes the fractured perception of world and self as it is experienced by patients of psychosis, but this dissolution is also part of the poetic program of Kane's theater. The author commented on the play accordingly in November 1998. I'm writing a play that is called 448 Psychosis. It's about a psychotic breakdown and what happens to a person's mind when the barriers which distinguish between reality and different forms of imagination completely disappear. That you no longer know the difference between waking life and your dream life. And also you no longer where you stop and the world starts. Various boundaries begin to collapse. Formally, I am trying to collapse a few boundaries as well, to carry on with making form and content one. The way in which Cain takes up the metaphor of breakdown, a psychotic collapse, in order to suggest the extent to which the also collapses traditional dramatic conventions, such as setting, temporal coordinates, and identifiable characters, shows that her formal experiments with lists are not only meant to depict psychotic breakdown and mental disorientation. Rather, they also serve to negotiate aesthetic questions about the nature of reality and its artistic representation. As she offers an experience of the world influenced by the symptoms of psychosis, Cain illuminates for her audience what it means to perceive the world from beyond the coherence of orderly narrative world-making. So Cain's lists express corporal and social alienation, the feeling of discontent or disconnect between the self and the world. And in the further course of the dramatic text, the fragmentation of the self is visualized through passages that introduce double and split texts. Looks like this. And we wonder how to read this. And people who want to have a performance of the play in the theater have to find ways how to perform this. So it is not clear because it is against our conventions of reading dramatic texts. As it disregards the notational conventions of the genre, Cain's dramatic text confronts us with the limitations of a practice of reading and writing that solely relies on a unidirectional sequence of reception. Such a fixed order from left to right, from top to bottom, can in no way do justice to the simultaneity of actual experience, nor to the overlapping perceptions, thoughts, and feelings that mark our every moment. So maybe how she perceives the world while she is under the influence of this mental condition, psychosis, might actually be much closer to the truth, to experience, to reality, than what we usually like to see represented in a text where everything is nicely ordered, structured, and linear. Cain uses and exploits the disturbing mental experience of psychosis, characterized by fragmentation and dissolution, to stimulate important aesthetic questions about a renewal of the formal possibilities of drama and eventually of literary texts as such. And finally, I'll turn to one form of storytelling that transcends the linear and allows for the representation of simultaneity, and this is maybe graphic storytelling. This can be shown when we turn to Marbles, Mania, Depression, Michelangelo and Me, by Seattle-based cartoonist Ellen Forney, who was diagnosed with bipolar disorder shortly before her 30th birthday. Forney's cartoons help her to reclaim authority over her newly imposed medicalized self-image by visually representing herself and her subjective experience in cartoon form. The inclusion of the remediation of medical lists and catalogs into her art creates what I will describe with Catherine Belling as stereoscopic seeing. Let me explain what I mean by this by turning to the second chapter of Forney's Marbles. In the chosen sequence, which represents the therapy session in which Forney is first confronted with her diagnosis, the reader experiences what Belling has termed stereoscopic seeing, and that is the product of an effort to focus on two different visual fields at once. Here it is. On the left side of the page, we witness a sequence that represents the listed entries from the DSM, so the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, that set out to define bipolar disorder. The visual feel that the cartoonist offers her readers makes us share the protagonist's outside perspective. She stands behind her therapist. Where can we see? We can see it here on the right-hand side. Looks over her shoulder and sees the different definitions and symptoms that are typical for the mental impairment. And at the beginning, she's very skeptical. But then Karen, that is her therapist, uses her index finger and shows her one after the other. So it's a bit like an act of persuasion as it takes place in rhetoric. And look at this, and look at this, and look at this. For Ellen as a patient, however, seeing the individual symptoms listed before her eyes does not only have the effect of a rational progression that might eventually lead her to the acceptance of the diagnosis. Rather, and this is what the unique layout of the page affords to show, Ellen constantly synchronizes the medical information presented before her eyes with a consultation of her inner mind. She creates a dialogue between the symptoms listed in the DSM and what she remembers about her feelings and behaviors during the last month. While on the left-hand side, the reader's glance is synchronized with Ellen's view over Karen's shoulder, it is her inner mind's perspective that we share on the right-hand side. While medical approaches try to understand mental illness through lists of symptoms and consequently concentrate on surface behavior, more talkative, decreased need of sleep, and abstract definitions, flight of ideas, distractibility, Forney balances these abstract surface-based restrictions and definitions with her inner reality and experience of being ill. As Forney synchronizes and dialogizes the listed criteria with the patient's inner world, her thoughts, memories, and feelings, she offers her readers a view on what science alone will never see, namely mental illness as subjectively experienced. Okay, so to sum it up, lists in literature that deal with illness have many different forms and fulfill many different functions. They highlight questions of representation, objectivity, and truth. They serve as a rhetoric device and as a means of immersion. They engage with medical checklist cultures from the patient's perspective. They use the fragmentary poetics of the list to challenge understandings of reality that rely on linearity and order and narrative coherence. And eventually, they remediate the practical lists, such as these diagnostic checklists, to synchronize them with patients' subjective experiences of illness, and thus allow for what Belling calls stereoscopic vision. Thank you. This was my overview of lists in literature that deals with health and illness.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anna, for this inspiring and fresh perspective on the multifaceted function of lists in literature and medicine. I really like, especially, your historical survey of, starting with Moore Flanders and then finishing with contemporary, example. Lovely, wonderful. So I would like to open for questions, but I'm going to first stop recording.